Welcome to the ShadowDragon Podcast, Season 3, Episode 9, where we've got Russ Robson, former PsyOp Special Operations Soldier, alum as well, and he's written a book, Unconventional Influence, the Ethical PsyOp Manual for Modern Business Warfare. Russ,
Love it. Sounds good.
tell us about yourself.
Rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, awesome. I appreciate you having me on. I love the crew. I've spoken with all the guys, most of the guys over there, and done a little due diligence on some of the backgrounds. You've got a real all-star team, so I'm excited to be on board today. Tell you about me. Let's see. Interesting background. I was a bluegrass drummer for 20 years. So I played in a band. We owned a dinner theater out in Arizona called the Rockin' Our Ranch, and it was a family place, and I played drums, so I led the band.
I love it.
Interesting stuff, yeah. And it's funny because later on I DJ'd and I correlate a lot of target audience analysis and storytelling and narrative warfare and all that. It's all layers. Right, it's layering these different ideas of identity, culture, messaging, symbols, all that stuff. But yeah, I was a musician for 20 years. 2008 hit, bottom dropped out of the economy. I started to look at other options. Me and two partners had a small marketing agency. We did like CRM automation and social media management back in 2010, 2009. And yeah, it was a tough go back then. And so I had a couple friends that had looked at or that were in the National Guard a little later on in their lives. And mind you, at the time I was 34 years old. So I joined late. But they had joined like the National Guard. And so I thought, I'd always been an adrenaline junkie. I thought, let's look into that. Maybe that can supplement what I'm doing business wise and do some fun stuff. And I took a couple recruiting assessments online. The Air Force, I was too old for. Navy, I didn't want to live on a ship. Marines, I thought I was too old for that stuff to roll around in the mud. And so looked at the Army, took an assessment, and it said the jobs that I would be good for were like, I hadn't heard of them. It was this job called Human, PsyOp, Civil Affairs, and Linguist, because I already spoke Spanish. And I was like, what are these jobs? And looked into them. And the more I read, the PsyOp job popped out at me like, wow, that sounds like kind of what I'm doing. If I could get that kind of training, apply it to business, how awesome would that be? How different would my life be? And so I was inspired. And I showed my wife. It was special operations and it was active duty. So I'd probably, at the time, I knew we were in different areas of the world. I was like, honey, I'll probably have to deploy. She said, as long as you bring in a paycheck, let's do it. And so she and I, at 34, decided to join the Army. I joined as a combat medic because special operations is not entry level. You have to try out for that, although they do have the X-ray pipelines now for PsyOp as well as SF. But at the time, they didn't have that. So my test scores, ASVAB, were good enough to do medic. And so I took that job, and I'd always wanted to be an EMT firefighter. So I thought this was kind of serendipitous, right? We'll do the medic thing. So I took a job as a medic. Right away, I went over to SF selection and assessment because I wanted to try out stuff. I just wanted to get in there and do stuff. I was 35. I turned 35 at boot camp, which was that's the oldest you can be in joining active duty Army. And so I was the old guys. There was nobody older than me except for like the old sergeant major, right? The commanders, they were all younger and all that. So I just kind of laid low. I looked young, so got away with it. So went through some selection assessment stuff. I was hurt because I'd gone to air assault school. So I had a strained IT band at the time. So I got dropped real quick, first gate. SFAS, went back home to Fort Campbell, and we were out the door to Afghanistan pretty quick. So 2013, went to Afghanistan, East Coast Province, Fob Salerno, with 2506 Band of Brothers. and came back and decided I wanted to go into more medicine stuff. And mind you, the PsyOp thing was in the background. I kind of forgot about it. And I was like, well, let's do this. Like, so I tried out for SOAR, flight medic, because that was out at Fort Campbell. So tried out for those guys. They were on the post there, and they're like, yeah, I passed their what was it? Their trauma lanes, and presented to their PA. And so they're like, okay, we'll send you to SOCM. So sent me over to Fort Bragg to go through SOCM, Special Operation Combat Medic School. Yep. And it was kind of always a dream of mine too, to go through. I just really admired that training and what those 18 Deltas and all those medics that came out of that. So I went 6 months into it. I double tapped or got below the threshold on a written test. And they're like, okay, you got a day one restart. I was like, oh no, we're not doing this. I was 36, right? I'm like, no. And at the time I had a buddy who was teaching at the schoolhouse in PsyOp. And he's like, dude, have you ever thought of PsyOp? And I was like, wait a minute, that's what I wanted to do originally. What am I doing? And so I jumped out of the SOCM pipeline, went and tried out for PsyOp, and the rest is history. And it went great. They picked me up. I went through the selection assessment. They taught me Portuguese as well as I already had Spanish. So they decided to teach me Portuguese there in the pipeline. Right away, got out of the training pipeline, and they shipped us out the door to Colombia. Worked in the U.S. Embassy there in Bogota. We had another team in Peru. So it was the SCAR region there, Peru and Colombia. Because I spoke Spanish well, I think that was the reason my NCOIC decided, hey, you're going to go live with the Colombian Army and go through their Colombian PsyOp program as a student. So it was me and a captain. And so we went through their Colombian PsyOp school. Is called ESMAI, ESMAI. I think it's the Escuela, the School of International Missions. It's kind of a hybrid of civil affairs and PsyOp because it's not outward facing, it's inward, and they use it to build relationships of trust within their own populace there. And so I went to school there. It was hard because I spoke Spanish well, but man, it was a different altogether speaking with the Colombian Army guys and living with them. And it was pretty rough, but got through all that and helped them tune up. They weren't doing area studies very well because they took for granted that they knew their own populations. And so we helped them tune up their PMISI PT area study stuff. We helped them do an actual target audience analysis, which they weren't really practicing that very much. And so I actually built one for the COLEX, the culminating exercise we went through with them, and built the target audience analysis. So they saw kind of start to finish what that looked like. Finish that up, and it went great. I was able to give some great feedback to the commander. And we got tons of value out of it as a force, and they got value out of it, hopefully. And came back home, worked in operations for a little bit, decided to get out. My kids were at an age where I wanted to get them near family again. So got out of Fayetteville, moved back to where my wife is from here in Utah. I'm from Arizona, but moved back here to Utah to be near cousins and grandparents and all that, and joined the 19th Special Forces Group as a SADE. So joined as a linguist, 35 Papa, with my Spanish and Portuguese, worked with Utah Counter Drug here for about a year full time. And then just did the guard thing for a couple of years and then got out. I got out last year, finished up an MBA this year, and we're like wrote the book, and we're off to the next chapter here.
Man, fresh out.
Yeah. Fresh, baby. Fresh.
Yeah. So you said, so you wanted to do PsyOp with the business kind of end in mind. You were already doing some early stuff, social media management, 2008 to 2010. Like that was pretty cutting edge stuff back then.
So we were building little Twitter engines, using third-party apps to help mom and pop business owners get a presence on Twitter through automated Twitter feeds, RSS feeds.
Oh, wow. Very cool.
Yeah.
So, and then tell us about, how did you train the Colombians on PMISI PT? how did you use tech? Were you using publicly available information down there? How did that work?
Very manual, very just, it was OSINT. It was open source. It was, let's gather what we know. For them, like we would target the Pamisi PT around like a village. So they had this knowledge of their own people, their own culture, but we had to focus it in. So we gathered that, organized it for them, showed it how that would look and how that informed the actual target audience analysis. And then we'd really narrow it down to a village, right? And use the whole ASCOPE framework to kind of target the area and all that. But we would start to use open source intel to just gather information through seriously Google, through surveys, through so on-site stuff and Google, I think, is primarily what we use, real low-tech stuff, and built just an understanding of the current kind of temperature of the people within that. Because, for example, our Colex was going to have an event within a small village there in Bogota, kind of the outskirts, a poor area, because there were drug dealers there and they were using the local youth to push your product. And so our job as a Colombian PsyOp school, we were tasked to build an event, conduct the event, and be able to build relationships of trust with the locals so that they would trust the army and give them intel on the daily happenings of what this drug dealer guy was doing. Mm-hmm. And so it was all about building those relationships of trust. And so, yeah, it was very rough and raw, the Pamisi PT, but going through their doctrine, they just hadn't applied it. They had it in their manuals and they were in the process of rewriting their doctrine, their manual. And so we just kind of like filled in the gaps for them. Like, okay, I get it. You guys know your people, you know your countrymen, but don't take that for granted and know that there are cultures within communities, and that you need to like not take that for granted, dig in and understand what the local beliefs, identities, cultures, context, all that is of your target population.
Yeah. Yeah. I should also mention too that two military guys on a podcast, Pamisi PT, political, military, economic, infrastructure, information. PT is I don't know. Help me out here. I forget.
Physical, environment, and time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we use Pamisi PT to build basically a common operating picture of a geographic area or a group of people. And a lot of times we were using publicly available information on the internet, especially if it was denied areas. Like I imagine you talk a lot about the FARC in your book. I imagine some of those areas you're using publicly available information. I know when we were looking at Yemen and we didn't have a U.S. presence in Yemen, we used a lot of Twitter information, a lot of social media, a lot of reports that we'd find online from non-governmental organizations, stuff like that. So just want to clarify for the audience there.
Yeah, for sure. We can use too many acronyms, alphabet soup, but no, for sure. Like in those areas, like the way I see OSINT, like everything ends up, all the ints end up as OSINT at some point, right? Your human intel collection, your SIGINT, your GeoInt, they all end up as OSINT at some point, depending on the time frame of when you're using it, real time, near real time, whatever. And then it's going to end up in the silo of OSINT, right?
Yeah.
In the world of OSINT. And so it's like how I love Nico, part of your team there. I was watching a podcast of his, talk of his the other day on the thinking behind OSINT. And I love it because it's few and far between that you'll get your hands on somebody who talks about OSINT and doesn't hyper focus in on a tool. Yeah. And I think it's the same with maybe SIGINT as well. Like when I was trying to learn that, I was trying to learn it after I'd already had 2 jobs in the Army, and nobody could tell me. It was the whole, if we told you we'd have to kill you. I'm like, yeah, but I'm here. I'm one of you. Like, can nobody like explain this to me?
Yeah.
And it really, the way I understand it now is very similar to how like those 14 points that Nico describes, as far as like, your brain is your number one tool, critical thinking, what's your theory, prove that theory. It's like the collect, analyze, and validate in my brain is kind of how I look at it when I'm working in the civilian world. And it's less collect. It's just kind of like, go out and find, right. And organize. And a lot of it is qualitative. When I'm working in business, like, I mean, there are models where like a lot of these, like, for example, in political marketing and in like large enterprise marketing, they'll use multi attribution methods where they take like credit scores, buying behaviors, platform information, and combine them into, okay, this is where they're at, this is what they're buying, so on and so forth. But when you're working like with small business owners, like I have, it's okay. Answer some questions. What keeps your clients up at night? What makes them uncomfortable? What's the biggest problem you solve for them? It's some of those qualitative questions it pulls out of their brain, so you can build a problem solution offer, and then be able to kind of turn that into something more specific later on through paid media or whatever. But yeah, I don't know if that answers, but I don't want to go on and on, but it's kind of all of it applies, right?
Yeah. No, for sure. We'll skip around on the questions because you hit on a couple of good things here. Couple of former PsyOpers take over an OSINT podcast. That's what happened. So I know when I was deployed, I was using publicly available information for all kinds of stuff. One of them was MOE, or measures of effectiveness. So if we were putting messaging out, a lot of times we would use publicly available information either in social media or chat forums or whatever to measure the effectiveness of our messaging. It sounds like you're doing a lot of that in the business world, and what you're talking about, the qualitative and even quantitative. So could you give us a couple of examples of maybe where you're using publicly available information or even finished open source intelligence products to kind of consult clients or use that to tweak messaging or refine it or make it better?
Yeah. So Meta is a great place, the Meta Business Group. And let me give you a quick story, like, and it's in the book. This measures of effectiveness it's the difference between, in Colombia, I was working, I was advising the commander there, and he's like, "Hey, this event we had," and I explained that event. He's like, "It was a great event, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I prepared a survey. The personnel didn't execute on it." And so I was like, I had a great relationship with him, Colonel Karan. And I was like, "Colonel, like, sir, it was great if you want to be a party planner." And he's like, "What?" I go, "Yeah, because they didn't execute on the survey. So we have no way to measure what we did. So you might as well just be hosting parties." He's like, "What? No." And so he went and taught all the students, "Hey, we got to measure. And so that's kind of the banner, like always measure. Interesting part of offer development when working with like a personality or a brand. Like, for example, I worked with a coach recently building out an offer, and started. He is a sports psychologist for youth, and I was helping him build out an offer, and started with qualitative, just like that worksheet, like pull it out of his brain, look for trends, build a high ticket offer that's based on an outcome. And it's a problem solution. I help such and such do this without this. Very simple, very clear. And so his was, I help youth athletes overcome game day anxiety. And through his method, right? And so we started with that. And then he actually got a grip on paid ads. He started to run paid ads and found that within Meta, you can stack interests because you can target on interests, and the algorithm is so good within Meta. Like it used to be a lot more. There used to be a lot more choices, but now a lot of the algorithm just does the work for you. But you can still target based on interests. And so he chose 10 interests and ran low paid ads, problem solution ads. I help athletes overcome game day anxiety through with my method, and ran so 10 interests. It could be like organizations that he thinks these young athletes would be a part of, or it was for their parents, right? They're the target. And so chose these 10 interests, and then running paid ads to those 10 interests, the top three, he'd take those top three and run and just maximize and run ads to those top three. What happened was specificity. Through measuring that, we measured the top three, pulled back and started to just focus on those top three, and saw that a lot of parents of swimmers, competitive swimmers, were coming out of the woodwork. And so all of a sudden his offer changed. It became more specific. It became, I help parents of competitive swimmers overcome meet day anxiety and enjoy their sport and lower their times. And all of a sudden, because of being able to measure through, in this case, it was slicing it through interests, because people online typically congregate around interests and problems. And so we stacked the interests and focused on those top three. And man, the winners came out of the woodwork and focused on parents of swimmers. And now that offer is flourishing, and it's supporting a whole practice, his whole business. And so, yeah, that measurement was crucial in finding out the specificity of the offer.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think some of that measurement, when it's done right, is used in any use case. I mean, methodical workflows for investigators used to catch criminals or, bad guys, terrorists, do due diligence. It's all there. I want to ask you about the cover of the book too.
Yeah.
Unconventional Influence. So you've got an iceberg here. Tell us about the tip of the iceberg down to the deep.
Yeah. So that was inspired by the narrative strategies team, Ajit Maan and Paul Kobach and those guys.
Yeah.
Howard, after working in PsyOp, I just felt like you probably felt the same thing. There was a lack of it was so tactical, and there was just a lack of a scientific method that brought it all together into a practice, into a solid craft. And when I came across Ajit's books, Plato's Fear, Narrative Warfare Guide, Dangerous Narratives, I was like, this is the overarching narrative of PsyOp. It's like being able to pull this together. And so the iceberg talks about the kind of levels of cognition. You've got, at the very top, if I remember it right, you've got messages and behaviors. And then down below the surface, you've got beliefs. And then down even below beliefs, you've got narrative. And narrative is the color of it's the water we swim in. It's the things that we're born into, like culture and our identity, how it's wrapped into it. In Dangerous Narratives, I love it. They talk about the three areas of cognition being space, time, and behavior. Mm-hmm. And I see that that the space is how I see myself, my identity. The time is who am I, the role within the story, right? What's my experience in this narrative that I'm living out every day? And then the behavior, what I do as a result of that. And so, that iceberg it just represents kind of the whole picture, that the deeper you go, the harder it is to fight the message and to fight the influence campaign.
Yeah. I know we mentioned Nico, and I know we just published a blog today by Nico, but he talks a lot about keyword searches and some of the things that an investigator could find from angry or emotionally charged users that put information online. And so I know, and you'll get this too, is when a psychological operation or some kind of influence campaign, a lot of what we would integrate with intelligence shops as well to try to elicit a response. And so a lot of it is online. And wonder if you could talk just a minute about the anger and the fear and some of the emotions that cause people to do things, especially online.
Mm. Yeah, those triggers, right?
Yeah.
And when you talk about kind of like linking up with the intel, like you've got the.
Let me keep it up for you too. You talk a lot in the book about the FARC and was it Operation Christmas Tree? Is that what it was?
Operation Christmas, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not anger, it's not revenge, but it's an emotion that elicits a response from.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. So in Operation Christmas, the demobilization of the longest standing guerrilla force, the FARC, after 50 years, they'd use force on force to try to like defeat these guerrillas, these sex, gun, drug, people traffickers, and they couldn't do it. And so they decided to change the game and try to win hearts and minds. And so what they did was they started with HUMINT. They saw that that Christmas was a vulnerable time for the FARC, that the dissenters, lower echelon fighters, would leave during Christmas. And so they started to do some interviewing of these lower echelon fighters, asked them, why were you leaving and why at this time? And the answer was, we feel as trapped as the people we are holding hostage. So these dissenters, that's kind of like a linchpin of these organizations, is there's always dissenters. They feel emotional about not being validated or valued. Mm-hmm. And so OSINT helps look for through keywords, through intonation, through length of posts and whatnot. You can find these dissenters, these unhappy, and it's UW, right? It's unconventional warfare. It's finding the unhappy population and being able to go in and build relationships of trust and on up the Sorrel pyramid. But with Operation Christmas, they felt trapped. So it was values and vulnerabilities. They felt trapped was their vulnerability, and the value was home for Christmas. And so they focused in on those two things. They found 75-foot trees along these strategic pathways in the jungle, wrapped them with Christmas lights, a motion sensor light, and a sign that said, demobilize. It's Christmas. At Christmas, anything is possible. And that worked. It demobilized about 300 fighters. And then they went on these they pivoted, and they found out like they really, it was through the collection and analysis of more and more data, more and more, whether it be qualitative face-to-face or through forums and different things, they found out the deeper connection to the human to human message. Started as at Christmas, anything is possible. And then it went to Operation Bethlehem or Operation Rivers of Light. Your family misses you. Operation Bethlehem, follow the lights to your family, your freedom. Operation You Were My Child. Before you were a guerrilla, you were my child. Yeah. And then changing that to a campaign of helping the combatants feel welcome to coming back to civil society.
Yeah, I love the story of the pictures that the parents gave, and the for the audience, they found parents of the FARC guerrillas, and parents would give up pictures of their kids when they were children. And how are the pictures delivered? How did that happen?
Posters around town, and they might have put them on trees, who knows, but for sure they were plastered everywhere. And it was actual pictures, old pictures, family pictures of mothers with their children. The children were guerrillas, known guerrillas. And the poster said, before you were a guerrilla, you were my child.
I love it.
Talk about human to human, like just yanking on those heartstrings.
Yeah, I love it.
That was the straw that broke the camel's back in that whole thing and led them to demobilization and past peace talks and turning the FARC from a criminal organization fighting against the system to a political organization being a part of the system. Like huge. And they're still fighting today. And when I got there, we were dealing with M19 and the Shining Path and FARC dissidents, and they're kind of jumping back into doing more stuff. So it's like an ongoing thing. And when it's political and the government's not doing what they should, that's going to happen. But that success was massive.
Yeah, I love that story. That's one of the best influence operations of all time.
It really is.
And it's great that we can share it because a lot of them we can't.
Yeah. I know that's what I was looking for. I was like, I can't share a lot of the stuff we do. So I was like, well, I'm here in Colombia. Let's share what they're doing.
Yeah.
And like pattern it after, like, well, they learned the stuff somewhere, right?
Yeah. You in the book, you take a lot from the book Propaganda by Jacques Ellul. It's got it right here, sitting on my desk. I'm ashamed to say it, but I was a cyber for almost 8 years and never heard of the book. No one recommended it until it's about a year ago. Ran into an old intelligence officer of the Cold War, and he recommended it to me. I started reading it and thought, wow, this would have been useful 15 years ago.
For sure.
One thing, it was written in the 60s, I think 1962 or 63, but a lot of what he talks about is modern technology back then. And it's mind blowing to read the book, and you can swap out words like television or radio, which was, new and not ubiquitous back then. You could swap those out with, an application, Twitter, TikTok, or Facebook, and an iPhone for, device delivery. And so, tell us some of the biggest takeaways, how the book Propaganda and Jacques Ellul, how did that influence you in the book, and give us a couple examples.
Yeah, it's not your fault. It's a hard read. It's a heady read. And it's small print too. It's rough, but yeah, I love that book. It's like a different feeling from like a Edward Bernays book or a Walter Lippmann book, or like it's a warning. He's very wise, and it's a warning about the uses of propaganda. So he gives kind of the mechanics of propaganda, but he also gives like warnings about using it. And he also wrote the book, The Technological Society. He says, every mass media or every mass society that's a technologically advanced society will have propaganda. Like that's just like the powers that be. As you grow as a society and you have mass technology, you have mass proliferation of messaging and all that, whatever government it is, they're going to use that and we have kind of a graph that's in the book of the information versus influence graph of, you've got the operational environment on the bottom axis, and then on the horizontal axis you've got psychological pressure, and you go from like inform to informed to educate to informed to influence, and as you go left to right, like the pressure increases. Informed to influence, persuade, I have it up here, compliance, coerce, and indoctrinate, and you get higher and higher in the psychological pressure each one of those phases puts on a person or on a group of people. But Jacques Ellul's book, he talks about how it's present, it's gonna be there, but be careful. Like, these are the inner mechanics of it, but be careful. But he says one of my favorite parts, number one, is that and I get this question a lot. I'm sure you do as well. Like, with our background being PsyOp, it's like people ask, like, "Hey, like, is it true? Are we all being PsyOped right now?" Right? It's like, and so that's one of my favorite questions. And the answer to that is, are there people playing with the knobs and whatnot of like applying political pressure? And yes, absolutely. But I will say this, and then they'll follow it up with, couldn't we do like a friendly PsyOp campaign to like PsyOp the PsyOpers? And so Jacques Ellul addresses this. He says, no. And words mean things. Words matter. Propaganda is a tool, and Jacques Ellul says that when Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi prime minister of propaganda, when he started, his propaganda was very effective because he didn't believe what he was communicating. As the propagandist, you can't believe your message because the message is to control the mass. And so by nature, you're not going to be a believer in the message of the people being controlled because you're the controller. And so he says, but as soon as Goebbels started to believe and drink the Kool-Aid and believe the message he was propagating, his effectiveness of propaganda became less and less. And so a propagandist will be affected and dehumanized by the message that he or she is propagating. So being a friendly propagandist is a misnomer. You can't do it. Being an unconventional influencer, that's a different thing, right? Title of the book, shameless plug. Influence is something you can do. And you can conduct influence operations, less of an operation, more in a business or personal context. It's becoming more influential at the self, team, and herd level, and being more and more effective at each one of those levels. But yeah, Jacques Ellul crystallized all that as far as like the warnings around propaganda. Like, words matter. It's not propaganda if you want to actually, like, if you care about your audience, if you believe in what you're saying, then it's not propaganda. It's influence.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you talk, going back to one of the, are we all being psyoped? Yeah, I guess. But, you have to gain attention first. Like, you have to gain someone's attention at this point. And so, I thought you did a really good job in the book talking about modern unconventional or modern UW and how it's changed with, digital communication. You talk about information warfare and autonomous operations. So, I wonder if you could just touch on that for a second. And then I would say one thing that you can do or that we do is there's so much information out there, but at the same time that in order to communicate, it has to be public. It has to be, a mass communication in order to get, effects at scale. And so for us, and this is where I think, my background as a PsyOper and then OSINT is you can use open source intelligence and publicly available information to see it, to identify it, and look at those indicators and catalysts, and basically look at what's coming. And if you've been doing it a while, it's easy to identify and easy to, predict what's coming.
Yeah, I think, and I was learning a little bit more about ShadowDragon's Horizon, and it seems like, is that the newest version?
That's the platform itself. Yeah.
Okay. Seems like the advantage there is that with Dan and the team, Elliot, that what they've all done is put the picture all in one place, all the tools all in one place, and just really sped up the ability to see those trends and to be able to use those tools all in one place, which, for conducting OSINT, that's no simple task. There's all kinds of tools. We talked about that already. And so putting them all in one place, all in one picture, and increasing the speed at which you can get through and use those tools is huge.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all real time. I mean, it's, all publicly available information. So, it's, it's all reconstructible. So, you don't get false positives from, some of the LLMs that are out there, but, yeah. And it just speeds up the process. That's all it is. We had a law enforcement customer who said, you just did in 60 seconds what took me 6 months to do. And so
that's huge
vindication. But
yeah. You were talking about the evolution of of unconventional warfare. And yeah, David Kilcullen, one of my favorite authors. He's a brilliant guy on unconventional warfare, wrote The Accidental Guerrilla. He's got a new book out on China and the US, and just a brilliant guy. He wrote an article on, I think it was the Scandinavian War Journal, on the evolution of PsyOp, or excuse me, the evolution of unconventional warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look up SORO, SORO, Special Operations Research Office, SORO Pyramid for UW, unconventional warfare, you'll see the bottom up. And it's funny, I've heard different big podcasts mention like, there's like a manual of top of world governments out there. It's like, yeah, that's unconventional warfare. That's what SOF does, right? But that's the model anyway we use, is that old SORO pyramid. But David Kilcullen talked about the SORO pyramid is very linear. It's bottom up. It's finding a target audience that's disgruntled, training, building relationships with trust, and it starts at the clandestine. At the clandestine level, moves into covert, and then finally, once it reaches the overt, past, it's kind of like that iceberg. Once it breaks the surface, it becomes overt, and everyone's aware of it. It's too late. Like you've already done the work, right? And so, David Kilcullen says that nowadays, with the proliferation of media, telephones, no longer do you really need to helicopter in a team to an austere location necessarily to be able to conduct an area study or build relationships of trust or be able to conduct UW. It's now like you can do it via the web, and you can do it all these other ways. And so now, instead of linear up and down, it's left, right, diagonal. It's all these, it's ongoing and dynamic. And so unconventional warfare, just as long as you understand that it's indirect, right? It's indirect influence. Brian Steed, he's part of the narrative strategies group. He talks about how dynamic influence, I think it's dynamic. It's complex influence. It's like looking at a billiard table, a pool table. Simple influence is cue ball hits 3 ball in the pocket. Complex is cue ball hits the 3 ball, that hits the 15 ball in the pocket. It's like and then if you add geographic, like mountains and all this other stuff to the pool table, well, now you see what unconventional warfare deals with. It's like indirect with all these geographic limitations. And so we really have to lean on, OSINT and all the ints to be able to gather this information, turn it into intelligence, and fuse intelligence and operations into one to be able to operate.
Yeah, I remember being at this is when I was still in the Army years ago. I think right before Dave Kilcullen came out with Snakes and Dragons, or Dragons and Snakes, can't remember. But he gave a presentation on on Russia invading Crimea, and he talked about that, the clandestine, and then there's this, then it goes overt, and then it comes back down maybe to covert. But he talked about liminal zone between those.
Right.
And so those, throughout the whole process, though, I think, and now especially after Russia invaded Ukraine, in 2022, I mean, we saw it. And I was, working on the Hill at the time. And because we had lived through Russia invading Crimea before, and some of the indicators that were, gave us warning was in Crimea, before Russia invaded, they would start to go around house to house and say, you're a native Russian, here's a Russian passport. And it's the passportization of that. And then that was Putin's legal argument for annexing instead of invading. And so early February 2022, we got reports of that happening in Donbass and Luhansk region. And when all the tanks and everybody lined up on the Russian border, I said, guys, I think this is gonna happen. And
popping off.
Yeah, and it did. And but we did that through, publicly available information. I know the Army and the DoD was doing the same thing. I know the intelligence agencies were doing the same thing, and it's all unclassed. You can see it right before your eyes. And now, of course, hindsight 2020. But anyway, the
That's historic, man. I can't believe you were there for that. That's pretty awesome.
yeah, it was
And with that Crimean experience, like, yeah, it's like Kilcullen talks about the liminal zones. It's the persuasion and influence that happens in the in between spaces between covert, overt, clandestine, and staying below detection. But man, it's hard to stay below detection nowadays. It's just like everything's out there. And
yeah.
if
Well,
you know what you're looking for and you have the right tools,
yeah, and that's the problem is that everything is out there, almost everything, but you have to cut through the noise to find the signal. And if you don't know what you're looking for, you don't have the right tools, then you get lost in it. It's really easy.
everything's just chatter.
Yeah. One more thing, I love Kilcullen's book. There's a picture of a ISIS fighter, and he's got kind of a homemade mortar tube, and he's holding an iPad next to it to dial in his mortar shots. And
Wow.
I've used that before as like the diffusion of tech to the lowest level. And I think about that for open source intelligence and drones and some of the other dual use tech that's out there. I mean, look at Ukraine right now, but like the point is like everybody's got access to the internet at this point. And so, everybody's an online sleuth. And open source intelligence is it's a team sport nowadays. So if you want to find something, it's out there. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I love that example too, because that's we've kind of forgotten our roots as a country. That's how we started with the Revolutionary War, right? Like we started as the guys just figuring out new tech and being resourceful instead of relying on resources. And it's these smaller countries and forces and non-state actors that they don't have the hard power, and so they've focused on the soft power.
Yeah.
And we've gotten behind and really relied on our hard power. And it's the soft power being like the influence and persuasion and using intelligence and using the information environment to shape things. Like we've gone away from that, unfortunately, but hopefully we can bring the craft back.
You're doing it. You're the proselytizer of influence operations, and I can sit on my OSINT throne, and we can do it together. Let's go, Russ.
Yes, I love it. Well, and that's part of it. Is at the end I talk about influence teams, and you guys have a great influence team. They're like influence teams. There's another book, forgetting the author, but it's I reference him in the book. He writes on using events and using events to push forward influence campaigns. And he talks about different roles and a cycle where you catch the wave. It's almost like the trend cycle, but it's like cycles within countries or populations or whatever it is, like information cycles and event cycles, like what you guys are doing with looking at Russia and the Crimean thing, the historical cycles there. It's like influence teams need to have particular roles and be able to be fundamentally sound in those roles of narrative analyst, coordinator, promoter. That's kind of how I talk about them. And having those roles identified and knowing how to leverage those roles within events and cycles, and having the tools to be able to keep an eye on the cycles so you can push them, you can pull them back, you can exploit them, you can do all these different things. It's like it relies on people with capabilities that understand the information environment, and I think you guys are leveraging that really good, especially with a PsyOp guy on the team.
Yeah, I like to think so. But last question. What are you reading right now?
Let's see. I've got a few books right on my desk here. My friend who's a SEAL, he's retired SEAL, told me to read this one, The Second Mountain, David Brooks.
Oh yeah.
If you're getting out of the military, read this book.
All right. David Brooks.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, cool.
He's really good. And then also, and I've got a few here. I've got Ajit's Dangerous Narratives on my desk here.
Nice.
I've read that a couple times. Yeah, a few books.
Awesome. Well, where can we find
I was also reading The Creature from Jekyll Island on Audible. So just
all right. Old school.
Old school.
When's your book out? Where can we find it?
Hopefully within the next 30, 60 days. It'll be on Amazon. It's under my full name, Russell J. Robson. And Unconventional Influence is the name. It'll be out within the next 60 days. I'm nailing it because we're in the last phases of editing right now. We're just polishing things up. But we'll have it out. That way, I've got one little plug in there. An informed populace is part of the solution, I believe, to the chaos that we're seeing nowadays. Mm-hmm. And I found a tool when I was in Colombia that I actually had to use in looking at propaganda from the Shining Path, a guerrilla organization there. I had to analyze their propaganda to be able to create products. And I think we take it for granted. We have a tool called the SCAME analysis, SCAME. And it stands for source, content, audience, medium, and effect. Mm-hmm. I had to picture it, and it really helps, especially with the election stuff going on right now, and with what happened in 2020 with the election stuff and Russia getting involved there. People need to think more critically about the things they read and about the things they see. And the SCAME analysis is in the book. It helps you kind of learn how to use a tool like that, a critical thinking tool, so that you might not be able to have x-ray vision right away in looking at a message. But as soon as you start thinking, okay, who put this message out? What's it about? Who's the audience intended? Is it intended for me? Is it intended for local police? Is it intended for Democrats, Republicans, whoever? And what's the effect? Is it effective? Like, as soon as you start thinking critically about these things you're reading, you stop being emotional about it. Mm-hmm. And you start actually kind of thinking through like the kind of logic behind it and what it's out there to do, which is emotionally hijack people. And so I'm hoping to have things out before the elections, because that tool, I think, can help people. That's why it's called the Ethical PsyOp Manual. There's a whole section on ethics, and because when we're deployed to a foreign area, like, their ethics are not our ethics. And so you have to have a quick on-the-fly framework to be able to make ethical choices that benefit both parties, right? So you don't cause an international incident. But I think all these tools are important for us in these times, in these chaotic times, to be able to kind of get a grip, put your hands on the steering wheel of awareness, and understand that it's not that bad. That as long as you're informed, you can't be hijacked necessarily, right? So hoping to get it out before then.
The Lul talks a lot about that too. The mind of the propagandist and the propagandee, and love it.
Yeah.
Well, we'll leave it there, and we'll have to have you back on when the book's out, and we'll talk about more influence operations in OSINT.
Let's do it. Love it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Russ.